Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this session on form assessment to planning and back. My name is Edna Corbett. I am Vice President for Institutional Field Relations at the Middle State Commission of Higher Education. Joining me today is Dr. Paul Starkey. He is also a Vice President for Institutional Field Relations with the Commission. Assisting us in the technical side of things is Miss Victoria Clark. Thanks, Vicki. And also we have with us a couple of interpreters. I want to thank them specifically, Ms. Sarah Wheeler and Sarah Blackberg. They will be interpreting for us today. I will be facilitating the assessment portion of this session, and then Dr. Starkey will take over later to facilitate the portion on planning and back. Also, you need to note that this webinar is being recorded, and we will make that recording available to you later on. First, on the screen, you will see our disclaimer statement. Please take a minute to read the disclaimer statement. I just want to highlight a couple things. This presentation you're viewing has been prepared by and is the property of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. Reproduction, distribution, or transmission of the presentation, in part or in whole, is expressly prohibited without prior written consent from MSCHE. And I'm going to jump to the last sentence, which says, this presentation is not intended as a substitute for professional advice from the Middle States staff, and use of the presentation does not guarantee any specific accreditation outcome. So here are the ground rules for participating in this webinar. If you haven't already done so, please silence your cell phone. We'll need you to use the chat function of the meeting platform to ask questions. Also, I want to ask you to be in the moment. We know you have many things to do. You're very busy people, but we need you here, and we appreciate that you're part of this session. Also, we sent you an advanced copy of the slide deck yesterday. So if you'd like to follow along with the materials that were provided to you ahead of the webinar. And also in that email that we sent to you, we asked you to rename yourself to include your institution, and we gave you the naming convention we wanted you to use. To submit the questions during the Q&A, you will need to use the chat function. And as you can see on the screen, at the bottom, you would see chat. And then that will open up that window on the right, and you can then type your message for the chat. Dr. Starkey will monitor the chat while I'm presenting, and I will do the same for him when he presents. So please note that we are planning to have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. As with all of our training sessions, we have identified learning outcomes. So these are, after participating in this session, we expect participants will be able to identify the MSCHE expectations for assessment and use of results in standards 5 and 6. Identify strategies for documenting the use of assessment practices and results. Understand the role of assessment in planning and resource allocation. And also discuss strategies for determining whether assessment practices are producing meaningful data for planning and resource allocation. Because mission is central to everything we do. And also, as you probably know, we expect that the accreditation process is conducted through the lens of institutional mission. Here's the mission statement for Middle States Commission of Higher Education. As you can see, the hallmarks of the Middle States Commission of Higher Education mission are assurance of educational quality, institutional accountability, institutional self-appraisal, institutional improvement and innovation, peer review, application of standards, and again, all through the lens of institutional mission. I'm sure you're familiar with the 7 Middle State standards for accreditation. These are the 7 standards: mission and goals, ethics and integrity, and so on. In no way are we trying to downplay or minimize the importance of the other standards, but I have highlighted for you standard 5 and standard 6. For this workshop, we will be focusing on those two standards: 5, educational effectiveness assessment, and 6, planning, resources, and institutional improvement. Why did we choose that? Because these two standards seem to often land institutions in warning or probation, as you will see later. As background for our discussion, since we'll be concentrating on assessment and planning, both essential elements of 5 and 6 are assessment and planning. I'd like to remind you that we also have what we call the requirements of affiliation. The requirements of affiliation are not isolated from the standards. In fact, they are very closely connected to the standards, and I have highlighted here in red the requirements of affiliation that are related to standard 5 and standard 6, which are the requirements of affiliation: 8, systematic evaluation of all programs; 9, programs characterized by rigor, coherence, and assessment; 10, integrated institutional planning; and 11, resources adequate to support educational purposes of programs and to ensure financial stability. So I'm not assuming knowledge of the requirements of affiliation and their connection to the standard. Here's a question I would like you to answer. So Vicky, please launch the first poll. The question is, I have a clear understanding of the differences between the requirements of affiliation and the standards for accreditation. Depending on the answer, I will add more information or not. Okay. I see that we have a lot of people who clearly understand the difference between the two. I'll give you 10 more seconds. Good. Thank you. Vicky, could you please share? Thank you. So here, as we see, we have 63% of people who said yes, definitely. We have 10% said no, but we have 27% that are not sure. So thank you, Vicky. You can stop sharing the results. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to talk about this difference for the sake of the 37% that are not sure or no. The requirements of affiliation, as the name indicates, are requirements when an institution is requesting to be accredited by middle states. These are minimum requirements that anybody who wants to apply for accreditation needs to meet. That's why some of those requirements, and I'll go back here, see if I can go back. My screen won't go back, so we'll stay here. That's why some of those requirements seem like yes, no. Are you licensed to operate? Do you have students enrolled? So those are yes, no questions. When it comes to the later ones, like the ones I was talking about, 8 through 11, those are requirements of affiliation that everybody needs to continue to be compliant with all the requirements, even if you were accredited back in 1921 or so. But these are more of a yes, no. Does the institution have assessment? Does the institution have programs with rigor? Does the institution have resources? So these are more yes, no type, while the standards, because it's not only the standard, but also there are criteria affiliated to each standard, then these are more nuanced. These is where we talk about compliance in substantial measure. That is, we don't use the criteria as a checklist. However, the institution, when they conduct their self-study, when they provide reports, they need to address the criteria, all of the criteria for the standards. And the nuance comes in that an institution may be in compliance, but there are recommendations of how to improve. And that's the difference between the requirements, which are yes, no, while standards are more comprehensive and nuanced. This is yet another piece of background I want to emphasize. This is our accreditation review cycle and monitoring process. This is the one that we use for institutions seeking reaffirmation. And so if you are in the audience today, it is very likely that your institution is somewhere in this cycle. So this is an 8-year cycle that begins with the self-study evaluation and the on-site evaluation visit. It moves on to the midpoint peer review, which is 4 years later, and then recycles back in the 8th year with the self-study evaluation again. However, we also have what we call ongoing monitoring activities. And these monitoring activities are through the annual institutional update, which is an annual update that all institutions have to submit related to their financial standing and also their student performance metrics. There are others, and I have not highlighted the others, but some of you, depending on your institution, may also have had recommendations, responses, follow-up reports, or supplemental information reports. All of that comprise the entire accreditation review cycle and monitoring. And again, one of the reasons why we decided to do this workshop is because a lot of institutions do end up with follow-up reports and visits resulting from non-compliance in standard 5 and 6. So look at the screen and you will see one of the main reasons why we decided to do this webinar. On the screen is the total number of all commission actions for 2018 and 2019. And if you're saying that this is thinking that you're old data, I want to remind you that we do have a pandemic going on right now, and a lot of visits were delayed last spring and this fall, and therefore we do not have current data for 1920 yet, because those institutions are still going through the process of accreditation and commission actions haven't been issued. So the latest data we have is 2018 and 2019. And as you can see, over 66% of total actions were related to standard 5 or standard 6. This is the number of non-compliance actions for that year. That is when an institution was on warning, probation, or show cause status. Out of the 70 non-compliance actions over the last 2 cycles, 62 were related to 5 and 6. However, this is actually skewed because of the situation in one particular group of institutions, especially for standard 6, which has to do with resources, where 42 out of the 55 non-compliance were because of financial issues for this group of institutions. So I'm putting the data in a little different now. So even if we take those institutions out of the picture, over 70% of non-compliance actions were related to 5 and 6. Hence the importance of this workshop, because it further explores the requirements regarding assessment, planning, and resource allocation. So let's look at standard 5. The standard 5 is educational effectiveness assessment. And the standard is assessment of student learning and achievement demonstrates that the institution students have accomplished educational goals consistent with the program of study, degree level, the institution's mission, and appropriate expectations for institutions of higher education. That is the standard. But the standard is not the whole of it. There are also criteria, as I said, associated with the standard. I will not go over all of it, but I will talk about the criteria. So assessment is one of the main standards, one of the standards for middle states. Assessment is expected of all of our institutions. I like to ask you, what is your purpose for doing assessment? So Vicky, if you could launch the poll, thank you. For what purpose are you doing assessment? Improvement, accountability, or maybe both? Okay. Still thinking about it? 10 of you? All right, Vicky, we can end the poll now. So here's the results. The majority, the great majority of you, 89% are saying both. Thank you. Thank you very much. 11% said improvement. That is certainly one of the purposes of assessment, but accountability is also a purpose. Assessment helps students learn more effectively. Assessment activities bring faculty and staff together to discuss important issues. So there's improvement. Assessment activities help faculty and staff see how courses link together. Assessment results provide important feedback. There's the accountability, but also improvement. Assessment brings neglected issues to the forefront. We find out what are some of the things that may not be going right, but we also find out what is going well. That's important to remember. And assessment helps faculty and staff make better decisions and use limited resources wisely. So I am assuming a lot of knowledge here, but just so we're all on the same page, I'm going to go very briefly doing a summary of the major steps included in the cycle of assessment. First, we begin with identifying goals and objectives for the program, which should be aligned to the institution's mission. These lead to the identification of specific student learning outcomes and criteria for success. Outcomes without criteria for success will make it very difficult for you to determine whether they have been achieved or not. You need to set a bar for success. But here's a note on criteria for success. Don't let perfection get in the way of the good enough. You then decide on the methods you will use to gather data for the assessment. Methods will probably require some professional development. So already there, we're looking at resource allocation that is associated with the standard. Then the data gathering needs to be planned and it needs to be conducted on a regular basis. Data without analysis makes assessment meaningless. It is just an exercise. And so if you want to implement a culture of assessment and a culture where faculty and staff and students and administrators buy into the process of assessment, there has to be some analysis of the data that you're gathering. Action plans are what we call closing the loop. The action plans will be discussed later with some examples of how assessment results can be used for improvement and also for resource allocation. Action plans is where your faculty, your department chairs, your unit directors actually say, this is what we learned from assessment, and this is the action that is resulting from it. Alignment of resource allocation then includes not only resourcing departments and units, but also resourcing assessment itself. Finally, assessment is the foundation, can be the foundation for planning, for resourcing departments, for operationalizing those plans, which then leads us back to, since the goals and objectives are related to mission and strategic plan, that leads us back to reviewing and revising the goals and objectives, and the cycle begins again. A question that I often get about this is, how long does the cycle take? The short answer, it depends. It depends on your institution. It depends on what you are assessing. But I can tell you, for assessment of programs, you need at least 3 semesters or 3 trimesters or quarters or whatever you're using, because you need to develop those objectives and decide on the methods. You need to then gather the data. You need to analyze the data. You need to have action plans and actually implement those action plans and assess again to see. So that's how you need to have at least sufficient time for conducting the cycle. Back to the standard. The process of assessing educational effectiveness is not only about compliance. So the assessment are processes that are designed to facilitate ongoing conversations with an eye towards shoring up those areas that we might see there are challenges or discovery of new ideas and approaches to improve our own institutions and student learning in all academic programs and for the learning goals and outcomes for the whole institution. Standard 5 includes 5 critical components, as you can see on the screen. The first is that every program, regardless of type, where it is taught, and regardless of modality, does that remind you of another standard, standard 3? These must have student learning outcomes and objectives that clearly relate to required courses and other educational experiences. Second, these goals and objectives are regularly assessed using appropriate, periodically collected assessment, be it qualitative or quantitative, and using defensible methods. See, we're going back to that cycle I talked about earlier. Remember that collecting and presenting assessment results alone is necessary but not sufficient to comply with all of the criteria with this standard and their related criteria, and their related requirements. So assembling assessment information, summarizing the result, and presenting them on a table is a good practice, but it's not good enough. There must be clear and compelling evidence that key people are getting together, whether it's at several institutional levels, they are looking at student outcomes, they are looking at institutional level outcomes, such as general education outcomes, or they're looking at individual academic programs. There has to be evidence that actually the assessment results have been considered. There must also be evidence that there is periodic use and follow-up. It is not that people got together and discussed it, but also that some lessons were learned from that discussion, that the data was used to improve student learning and also to improve institutional goals. There must also be evidence in the 5th point. There must be evidence of an overall evaluation of the meaningfulness, usefulness, and efficiency and cost effectiveness of the assessment at all levels of the institution. Meaning that very last criterion for the standard, you are assessing the assessment process. So it is perfectly acceptable if at the end of an assessment, of one cycle of assessment, the data that you have gathered does not provide sufficient information for improvement of a program. But if you demonstrate that the data you gather provided sufficient information about the assessment process, that is a legitimate use of assessment data for improving the assessment itself. So this is what many colleagues and peer evaluators are expecting from academic assessment, the structure of academic assessment, that you will have course level assessment. Then those Course level assessment feed into program assessment. And in a lot of institutions, this takes the form of what they call program review. But in addition to that, there should be general education assessment if you are an undergraduate institution. If you are a graduate institution, you may have institutional learning outcomes assessment. But undergraduate institutions also could have institutional learning outcomes that are reflected throughout all the programs. And this is what our graduates will be able to do once they finish their education with us. And they may be different from general education assessment, depending on how you interpret general education at your institution. There is also expectations when an evaluator comes to visit you, when a team comes to visit you, they expect to see some sort of infrastructure that guides the assessment at your institution. So they expect that there would be institutional policies and procedures. And an example of an institutional policy is, for example, program review. All of the program, regardless of departments, they have to do program review. So this is an institutional level policy and procedure. But then they will probably expect to see also department or unit level policies and procedures for assessment. So a department may have 5 different academic programs, and they have policies and procedures for their 5 programs that they all have to comply with. But then they will also expect that there will be structures to enforce those policies and procedures. There's no point in having policies and procedure if no one is checking, if no one is coordinating the process, because then the other pieces of the assessment cycle will not occur. The analysis of the data, the connection of the assessment results to resources will not occur unless you have structures to enforce those policies and procedures. So here, I'm not going to go through this individually. You will have a copy of this slide, or you have a copy of this slide already. So here are the features of effective assessment processes, whether it's institutional or unit level. We expect, we would like to see the following features: that it is sustainable, that is, it can be maintained over time. This is not only about the self-study. This is something we want to see, that it is sustainable, and we also need to see that there are resources for that sustainability. That it is pervasive. It applies to the whole institution. It applies from unit to unit, from institution to unit, and apply to all academic programs. Often what happens that institutions get in trouble with this standard is because they have assessment in some, but not in all. And so a team may find the institution out of compliance, even if you provide a beautiful example, and they ask for example in another department and you can't provide it, they'll say, well, then it is not pervasive. Effective assessment is also appropriate. It is defensible because any assessment relates directly to what you're trying to evaluate, and also is implemented within an acceptable time frame. It should be efficient. This should not be an onerous process. This should be something that becomes part of the work that faculty, staff, administrators already do. It should not be an inordinate amount of effort to collect, organize, document. However, documentation is very important because of the time of the team coming to your institution. If you don't have evidence of what you're doing, then they will have trouble finding you in compliance. So, where are we now? Good. We are exactly 30 minutes into it. Let's do an activity so we can break up a little. So I'm not the only one talking here. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms. We have currently How many people? We have 88 people participating right now. Vicky is going to put you in groups of 6. And so we might end up with one group with only 4, maybe, but Vicky is going to then send you randomly to breakout rooms. And when she does that, you will see a pop-up window in your screen. You will click the green, or sometimes it's a blue join button, and you will be with others in the group. The first, identify a group leader or note taker, discuss the questions, and since you have an advanced copy of the next slide, you should, I don't know that I can actually make it possible for you to see it, but you should have an advanced copy. Discuss those questions, and then 1 minute before the activity time ends, you will see a countdown clock, and you will know that you have 60 seconds to finish your discussion, and then you automatically will come back to the main Zoom meeting. You may be automatically muted. I think everybody's muted when you come back. So, but when you go into the breakout rooms, you will be able to unmute yourself. So these are the questions. Discuss with the group, what is the current campus infrastructure for academic effectiveness assessment? Do you see any gaps? And what is needed to fill in the gaps? Everybody will have about 2 minutes to talk about their own institution. So Vicky, are we ready? We can send the group?
Yeah.
All right. See you in about 14 minutes.
Hello.
Hi.
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 Hello?
Hi.
Hello.
1 second.
Okay.
This is-
How do we know who's in the
Breakout group? I don't know who's in my group.
Something happened here on my screen. This is Robert Goldschmidt at Turo. I don't know. Let me just see. 1 second.
So this is Callie Kasudas at Plaza College.
This is Timothy Stevens at Yeshiva University.
I don't think we've been divided
This
into
is
breakout
Karen
rooms.
Matthews.
I don't think we've been divided.
We're not in our breakouts yet.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, yes.
No, she said about 6 to 8, and there's 50
5
billion
pages of
Right,
us.
there should be only 6 people in each room. Vicky, are we?
Yeah, let me see something.
Are we going to be able to see the questions when we get to our groups?
In our breakout room?
Not
You will
yet.
be able to
Not
see the
yet,
questions
okay.
in the breakout room, which is why I sent you the
Okay.
advanced
All right.
copy.
I don't see the questions in the advanced copy.
Yeah, I don't have
Yeah.
this.
If
They're
they're
not
not,
in the advanced
Mistake.
copy.
they're not in the event.
Totally my mistake. Okay,
Okay, just confirming.
Yes.
so these
question-
are the questions.
Edna,
Yes?
there seems to be a problem with the breakout rooms.
Ah,
Yeah, with technical difficulty.
all right. We are nothing if not flexible, aren't we? That's middle states.
I hope
I
that
can see
applies
a
to
lot of
campus
people-
visits.
I can see a lot of people in this group. You know, I see Anita. Hi, you're first one in my group. Okay,
Can we
so
put the questions
let's do
in the
this.
chat?
We're going to adjust. Okay, let's do this. We're going to make it a whole group discussion. And so I'm going to, what do you think, Paul? Should I call on people? Maybe I will.
Sure, but Edna, you may want to, no, we could stay here because this is functioning like a breakout room, and then we can go back to the main room so that you've got your slide deck when you're ready to. Okay?
Yeah, but if we're back in the main room, I can't see them. And
Exactly.
they can't see each other. Which is actually why I like this, having you all here, right?
Can we post the questions to the chat? Because then we would be able to see them.
Ah,
I'll start putting them up.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it. This is like when you're in a ballroom and the alarm bell sounds and you have to adjust to it.
I can start.
Okay. Oh, Bushra, hi. Long
How are
time
you,
no
Edna?
see.
Yes, since Paris, the virtual visit.
Yeah. So here's the first question. What
Okay.
is the current campus infrastructure for academic effectiveness assessment? And here I want to hear, what do you have both as infrastructure that I talked about, or they may be something else that you
Okay.
have. So Bushra, go ahead.
So to introduce myself, I'm Bushra Rahal, Director of Institutional Accreditation at the American University of Beirut, Lebanon. I want to highlight the current infrastructure at the American University of Beirut with regarding to assessment. So, and the somehow short-term plans of revisiting all this, especially after Middle States review of our reaccreditation in 2019. Currently, we have 3 units, independent units. One is the academic assessment unit, which oversees the program review, the periodic program review, the program learning outcomes of all undergraduate and graduate programs at the university. And we had a separate institutional research and assessment unit as an infrastructure, also independent unit that assess the university through surveys and benchmarking, and another unit which is the enrollment management unit, but they were working in silos, and there were overlaps somehow in the functions, and the team when they visited the university last year had this observation rather than a recommendation, because we were doing really a good job in the assessment and we somehow were overdoing assessment. And they recommended that we look at the infrastructure itself and the organizational structure with regard to assessment with a fresh look. So currently we revamped these 3 units into 1 unit, that is institutional effectiveness and decision support unit, whereby all of them are merged into this unit, and the proposed plan is that they work collaboratively and cohesively to have institutional effectiveness and improvement as the outcome, and mainly to fill the gaps that we observed during the self-study, which is we don't really and regularly and periodically, as you said, Edna, in your presentation, make use of assessment for improvement. So obviously, and in a documented way, we do it, but not in a consistent and periodic way that we should, and driving this into a higher level whereby it feeds into informed decision making at the institutional level for our renewal. This is what we hope and aspire to do regarding the infrastructure, and these were the gaps that we have been at least trying to fill over the past year.
Thank you for highlighting what the team said, because that's exactly what I was saying. The team is expecting to see some of that infrastructure. How about, I'm going to put in somebody else. Wilson College, is that you, Cindy?
Hi, it is me, Edna, and you may be aware our self-study visit ended yesterday. So everything is very fresh on my mind right now. And this segues nicely from what AU talked about, because I'm a small college, I'm a one-person shop, but all of those things flow through my office. I'm work with faculty on academic assessment, and we have identified institutional learning goals, and they have been in place for at least 6 years prior to my arrival. And so the faculty, those ILGs are tied to our mission. So that very nicely fits. We are in the process of developing a new strategic plan. So that integration is not there yet, but because I'm involved with the development of the new strategic plan, we can assure that alignment in the plan we are currently working on. And because all data all of that information flows through my office, it does allow for that centralization, which I think is very important. I would not understand how separate offices could make this work as well. So I understand what was just said.
Thank you. So now we've had one of our international institutions, we had a small college, we have somebody from a larger institution that I can ask to help us out. Let me see if I can. If you don't volunteer, I will volunteer you. Let's see. Who do we have? You have somebody from St. Joe's University. That's right down the road. That Jill? Laura.
Hi, yes.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, fine.
So I am very new to my role as ALO and Director of Institutional Effectiveness. I've been in the position for a little over 3 months, but I know that all of the assessment activities are managed by our associate deans in the respective colleges, and they track all of the assessment activities as it relates to programmatic accreditation if appropriate, and then also the student learning outcome assessments as well. We are in the midst of academic program review right now. We're in year 2, well, kind of year 2. Year 1 kind of got delayed for obvious reasons. So we're wrapping up year 1 with a pilot group of 6 academic departments. My office facilitates the process. And then, so right now, the outcomes of the self-studies for each group's program, for each department's program review, as well as the comments from our academic curriculum and assessment teams. They reviewed the program review and for the majors and minors, that comes in, and then we start to look in the provost office at efficiency measures and resource allocation, and provide final comments to the deans and to the provost for evaluation in the next cycle of planning and resource allocation. So we're wrapping that up for our pilot departments, as well as planning that for the remaining academic units as well. Sorry, that was very long-winded.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. So there are largest, before I came to Middle States, I worked for very large institutions, and it was similar like that. We had department level assessment coordinators. There was a college level assessment committee, and then there was a university assessment committee. But as you see those things, it is not enough to have the actual structures. They need to be working. And in fact, I am working right now on a different kind of webinar for next week, which is about follow-up reports. When you are in trouble, when you are in non-compliance, you need to write a follow-up report. And one of the examples I'm giving is, it is not enough for you to say we have an assessment committee. It is not enough for you to say these are the members. You actually need to show what the assessment committee does. You actually need to show that they have considered that whatever structure you have has produced sufficient information. And one of the, this morning, actually, I was talking to a team chair for a follow-up team, and she is a provost, and she was telling me, I actually asked for impact reports. And I thought that was a very good way of saying it. There is all these. She doesn't ask only for assessment results, or you upload it to whatever you have, Nuventive or Weave. She actually asks, what's the impact? Because that's what guides her decision-making in terms of resource allocation. So that is one of the pieces, if nothing else, one of the things that I want you to get out of this conversation is the fact that you need to show impact, but you also need to show that whatever infrastructures you have, you're actually following them. And there is some documentation that shows that you're following them and something has resulted from it. It can be improvement to programs. It can be improvement to departments. It can be improvement to general education. Or if nothing else, you should at least show improvement to the assessment process itself if what you're doing is not providing sufficient information for you. Okay. You have one more person maybe would like to participate.
I can go. Darlene Weaver, Duquesne University. And I'll just speak to a piece of our approach to assessment. We use Weave as our assessment platform. And we are actually piloting a new standardized assessment template in Weave for our programs right now, because we observed that across different programs, and this wouldn't really apply to our professional schools, but particularly within our college and our School of Natural and Environmental Sciences. They were doing very different things in uploading their assessment reports each year, and also they were heavily reliant on narrative to talk about assessment, which made it really difficult to compare certain metrics across programs, and also impossible to run reports. Like there's just not bandwidth to cull through, like 30-page narratives from every single
do text analysis
degree program. Right. So this year, we created a standard template this year, and the school, I've been doing an awful lot of workshops for that. And they're being completed now, and then we will essentially analyze the inputs and have follow-up conversations to assess the template and make revisions, before launching, an updated template next year, for next year's cycle. So that process has been a good one. There's some grouchy people across campus as they're trying to get acclimated to doing things differently. I think there are plenty of people who would like to just make a few edits to their 30-page narrative and resubmit that. But it's also, we've been trying to, the template importantly, and I think this is one area really of improvement for us, is that the template certainly includes student learning outcomes, but also includes other categories like faculty excellence, the fiscal health of the program, and a section on a continuous improvement plan, right, with different metrics, including diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example. So getting programs to think holistically about how they're doing, not just these are the targets we hit with student learning outcomes, but what do these other dimensions of program health, tell us.
Indeed. And you are touching on standard 6 right there when you're talking about faculty productivity, when you're talking about all of that. So you're touching on both 5 and 6. And I'm glad you mentioned template, because whatever platform you're using is only as good as the template you put in there. If you don't have a template that is asking for the right information, they will give you whatever they think should be, or whatever makes them look good, or whatever it's easier to describe. So your template, it is, and again, I am working with several institutions that are on probation and warning right now, and that is one of the issues. There is information there available, but it is not information that can be used at the higher level because there is no consistency of what people are reporting. So I'm going to get us out of the group. Vicki, can we get us out of the group so I can finish up my portion, and then we can
you have to finish sharing. You have to share your screen, Edna.
Okay. Let me just double check. All right, so let me, there we go. Are we good now?
Yes.
All right. So let me finish up my section. Thank you. Thank you very much for that conversation. So one of the things that we have done at Middle States, and I have to thank Dr. Sean McKittrick, who has done an incredible amount of work over the last year, you know, talking about text analysis and analyzing what everybody's reporting on. He actually did a summary and pulled together a list of the most common types of documentation that our institutions that were reaffirmed were using to document their assessment. So here are some examples. For course level assessment, many of the successful institutions provided policies and procedures and expectations. Remember what I was talking about in terms of that structure? They provided sample syllabi that included learning outcomes, clear connections between outcomes and assignments. So here's something that one of my institutions, as I was doing self-study pre-visit, said, we have thousands of syllabi. What am I supposed to be doing with all of these? This is where you select the syllabi and then you highlight what are the elements of the syllabi that document assessment practices such, and then you talk about it and you do an analysis and you select a representative sample. They also provide evidence of consistent assessment in multiple sections of the same course. So all learning outcomes from that course, regardless of who's teaching it, you can show that the students are meeting the same learning outcomes. They provide evidence of discussion of those course level assessment results. What is evidence of discussion? It could be minutes. It could be summary notes that are distributed to everybody. You can be very creative of how you will provide evidence of discussion. And a lot of them, they also include rubrics. So, but rubrics themselves are not enough. You also need to include the description of the assignment and how the rubric will be used. And this is what I often see. People provide rubrics and then I'm the evaluator and I'm supposed to guess what this rubric is about. So please provide the context. And so I like Linda Susky's quote here is, the greater the variety of assessment evidence, the more confidently faculty will make inferences about student learning. For program assessment, these are the things that successful institutions have provided. And of course, the list is really, really long. I could probably provide the list if you want it, but I pulled out the ones where we had in a cohort of about 65, we had at least 20 to 25 people, institutions providing this. For program assessment, they provided policies, procedures and expectations, just like course level. They provided curriculum maps that show the progression of achievement. They provided program assessment plans. But then the plan is only as good as what you include in that. And so program assessment plans are not only about what you're going to assess and who's going to do it, but also how you're going to do it, when you're going to do it. And there should be a column there of what are you going to do? What are the results and what are you going to do with them? So they provided evidence of discussion of program review results. I say, what are you going to do with it? The action plan. And they provided an evidence and emphasis on direct assessment methods rather than indirect. It doesn't mean that indirect assessment methods are not good. It just means that the emphasis, particularly for program assessment, should be on indirect assessment methods and not only, for example, a survey of your seniors asking if they think they have met the objective. This is another group of examples of documentation they have used for general education. Do you see a pattern here? Policies, procedures, expectations. They also have identified general education outcomes and multiple learning opportunities. So there's not only the one course where that learning outcome can be achieved. They also included sample syllabi, but the sample syllabi, I actually was looking at an institution about a month ago where they provided sample syllabi, and I had the list of general education outcomes, and I'm looking at the syllabi, and there is no connection between them. If the syllabus does not include at least one of the learning outcomes from your general education, then how is that course meeting the requirements for general education? So this sounds, for some of you, this may sound really basic, but I have actually seen that. They also provide evidence of discussion of general education assessment results, particularly if they have a Gen Ed committee. And the Gen Ed committee does more than approve courses that can apply for Gen Ed. That Gen Ed committee should also be looking at assessment results and action plans for revising and improving that assessment. And again, direct assessment methods for general education. How do they document institutional learning outcomes? It's very similar to the Gen Ed. You want to identify different learning opportunities for that institutional outcome, but you want to show, because this is an institutional level, that there is evidence of consistency across all departments and programs. Because this is something, the institutional learning outcomes are something that all students, regardless of program, they need to meet. Again, evidence of discussion of those institutional learning outcomes, and that may happen in many different ways. I have seen that with institutions, smaller institutions conducting an all-day retreat to talk about that. I have seen in larger institutions where the department chairs, the council of chairs discusses this kind of thing. So you should probably ask yourself, where in those administrative structures are people talking about assessment? If they're not, then you need to be doing something about that. So here's activity 2. So this one's easier. It doesn't require you to go into rooms, but if you could use the chat function, list 1 or 2 ways that you are documenting assessment. Maybe just one way, since we have so many people, that you're documenting assessment that I have not discussed in the previous 4 slides. And I'm going to ask Paul then to look at our chat and comment on that. I will try to look at it.
Our folks are being a little shy today, and they're not offering us.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Well, since I'm not seeing anything in the chat, I'm going to, I have a question here.
Here's one, if
Okay.
I can interrupt you.
Sure.
This is from Houghton College, and they said they use portfolios and other types of student work samples.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And do the portfolios have rubrics associated with them? You don't have to answer.
Shanti says she has a question. Is it necessary for all programs to have standardized assessment? Because many programs are so different in structure, and some have programmatic accreditation to conform to, and others have career objectives to achieve.
Mm-hmm. It is not necessary for all programs to have standardized assessment. It is necessary for all programs to have assessment. They may have different structures, because remember, you can have institutional level, but you can also have program, department and program level structures. And those structures and those policies will depend also. If you have an externally accredited program, they may be dictating a lot of how you are to conduct assessment. But if you don't have an externally accredited program, then you absolutely need to develop that structure for them. And the whole point is, if you have institutional learning outcomes, the outcomes may be the same, but the programs may be reaching those outcomes in a different way and therefore using different ways, different methods. What you need to document at the time of the self-study is that since you have institutional learning outcomes, that actually the programs, all programs are addressing those outcomes and that they're producing results that have been analyzed. So then you can close the loop and go back and look at those institutional learning outcomes and see if they remain relevant for your institution.
So we had a response to your question about the portfolios, and do they have rubrics? And the answer is absolutely.
Wonderful.
One level of, one way one of our institutions has done is have the General Education Committee report to the Faculty Senate as a means of managing. So a question for you, Ina. Is it necessary to have institutional learning outcomes when we have aligned all learning goals outcomes at the school and program level to institutional learning goals? So to avoid another layer of assessment using data from program assessment that aligns.
You can use data from program level assessment as long as in the program level assessment, you are actually including the institutional learning outcomes. You don't need to have another layer, but you need to be able to pull from those program level assessments in order to draw conclusions about the institutional learning outcomes.
So another example of integrating, this is integrating lessons learned in assessment process to faculty development activities. And then at Bucks, they say they have committees of knowledgeable faculty who are not the course instructor that apply the rubrics to student artifacts. And so it's almost like they have an outside evaluator.
So are we, I'm not getting the gist of what the question is, or that's not a question.
That was an example. They have knowledgeable faculty who are not the course instructor.
Got it. Okay, good example. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on from here so I can give us time for the next piece. And so let me finish this portion with criterion 3 of standard 5. Criterion 3 says that you need to show use of assessment results. Consideration and use of assessment results for the improvement of institutional effectiveness. And notice that this one says, consistent with the institution's missions, such uses include some combination. It is not requiring that you do all the way from A through H. It's some combination of the following. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some examples. And if I have the time, I'm going to then highlight some of the pieces. So assessment results can provide insight. A is assisting students in improving learning. So assessment results can help you determine the appropriateness of course assignments. This is particularly important when you have multiple sections of the same course. And you want to make sure that the course assignments are appropriately addressing the learning outcomes. So if you do an analysis of assessment results for that course, and remember we talked about one of the examples is multiple assessment for the same, multiple sections of the same course. This is a very good way that you can use assessment and you can demonstrate, through documentation that you are addressing the appropriateness of course assignment by looking add assignments across several sections of the same course. B is one that is actually, I wouldn't call it required, but every team is looking for B. How are you using assessment results to improve pedagogy and to improve curriculum? So some of the things I repeated, but for different reasons. So you're going to use assessment results, and this is a moment where actually I had originally highlighted adequacy of curriculum maps, but I probably should highlight alternative instruction methods, because this is the time when we are all using alternative instruction methods. And so when people ask me, how are we going to do assessment during this time? It is actually a very good time for you to look at alternative instruction methods and determine how well the students are meeting those learning outcomes, and determine how you can improve pedagogy, how you can improve the curriculum if you all of a sudden have to go from face-to-face to online. Now is the time when you actually need to show that regardless of how you are conducting instruction, the students are continuing to meet the same learning outcomes. This is another one that, again, is not, I wouldn't say required, but it is one that most teams are going to be looking for. How are you using assessment to improve key indicators of student success? And here you are connecting with standard 4 as well, but you are looking at student retention. Assessment can tell you if there are roadblocks in the curriculum that are not allowing the students to progress in a timely way. Assessment can also show you where support services are needed. And I'm using the example of transfer students because in one of my institutions, I saw clearly that they were doing assessment. They had a large number of transfer students, and they assessed student learning in the 2 or 3 courses that most transfer students come in to take into their program. And they realized, they did a comparison between transfer students and, for lack of a better word, native students. And they realized the transfer students are not doing as well. And that led to an improvement of the curriculum and led actually to an improvement of the sequence of when those courses would be taken. There's a very clear example of using assessment results to improve indicators. You can use assessment results for reviewing and revising academic progress. That's what most people are doing. You can do it by determining relevance of program content. And I want to highlight here timing of course offerings, because that is one assessment can tell you if the sequence you are using or when the course is being taught. I have seen clear cases when, for example, 2 courses were co-requisites, and then as a result of assessment, this program decided that the co-requisite was not the appropriate way of teaching these courses, that they actually needed one to be prerequisite of the other. And it also, in the end, led to improvement of student retention because students were doing much better as they changed from it being co-requisite to being prerequisite, one of the other. You can use assessment results for improving professional development activities. A clear one is faculty knowledge of assessment. How many of you in your PhD or EDD or your master's program in name whatever discipline really were taught how to use assessment and how to do assessment? So this would be a way to use assessment to show the pockets of where faculty knowledge is needed, faculty expertise and instructional methods as well, but also support staff knowledge of the program. And then you assess your actual development activities to determine which ones are the most effective. Another way that you can use assessment results is for improved processes and procedures in programs. And so I like to highlight, for example, indicators for improvement in advising processes. This is where student support and curriculum come together. And you can use assessment of advising to improve curriculum, but the other way around. You can use assessment and curriculum to improve how advising is done and what advising is done and when. So it can be very useful information, particularly if you have program level advisement rather than centralized advising. Those two things should be working together, and assessment can be a very good, it can provide, as I said, if you're doing the right assessment and asking the right questions. Assessment results can also assist in determining if the practices are yielding useful data. If at the end of the day, you have all of this data and none of it is really useful, then you need to find what is the problem. Is it the policy? Is it the procedures? Is it the methods? Is it the infrastructure? You can develop better ways to report. Remember what we said, the template, that platform is only as good as the template. You can use assessment results to analyze what your template says and then say, we're not asking the right questions. And this is one that I see, particularly now that we're asking for priorities for self-study. A lot of people saying we want to promote a culture of assessment. So how are you going to promote the culture of assessment? How can assessment results help you? Well, first of all, if assessment is not being used, you won't have faculty buy-in. But by streamlining processes to make assessment less onerous, you can then promote that culture of assessment. If by using those results and closing the loop, you can convince people that actually there is a purpose. Remember back at the very beginning, it is a purpose not just for accountability, but purpose for improvement. And higher education is all about improvement, it's all about changing and looking for better ways of doing things. And if you make assessment an integral part of planning, and in many cases clearly show resource allocation dependent on assessment results. And here's my connection to the back. Assessment results can also be used to include planning and budgeting, both in academic programs and in services. So assessment results can inform faculty workload. It can also highlight the need for additional faculty or staff. It should be required to provide assessment results as the rationale for budget requests. It can be used for determining return on investment and resourcing innovative ideas, because assessment results can lead to innovation, can lead to many new ideas. And so because you have demonstrated that your ideas, you can demonstrate the impact of your ideas, then administration, the people with the money, are better able to see how resourcing those ideas can actually lead to improvement for the whole institution. So what type, again, summary, what types of documentation should you be providing? You can provide plans, you can provide reports, but I want to highlight the process graphics are really a very good way. Instead of providing to the team a 16-page process of how you're doing things, do a flow chart. Flowcharts are wonderful. It's only one page. And most people, not everybody, but most people are visual learners. And so you can actually use those graphics. I was at an institution where we used the graphics to demonstrate what we were doing in assessment. And in the end, they became part for the course in the assessment handbook, because the graphics were a lot easier way to demonstrate to people what follows what. It can improve. You can provide meeting minutes, but one that people always and often forget is you can document by doing copies of communications. For example, when the provost sends in, an all faculty communication, this is what we're doing on assessment. Or when the provost or the dean or the department chair in their newsletter include, this is what's happening in assessment. So there are many different ways that you can document that assessment results have been communicated. So in summary, effective assessment enhances communications, I said before. It can lead to better focus on alignment of activities and strategies. It should not only enable organizational improvement, but also organizational innovation. We see it through the lens of missions, so it helps us meet the mission and the vision of the institution. It helps us focus on the priorities, so things are not in the outskirts, but actually aiming toward what the entire institution wants to accomplish. And ideally, it improves planning and resource allocation decisions. So here's a screen that you won't find in your advanced slide. But as I was looking for assessment resources during COVID, I ran into this website. I don't know how many of you have seen it already. And I am not, and Middle States is not in no way endorsing. We are not in the habit of endorsing anybody. But here I found an amazing compilation of what people from many different institutions were doing to conduct assessment during COVID. I have not looked at all of the items. So again, I am not endorsing it, but I thought it was worth sharing with you that you would probably should look at that. So let's take a break. We'll be back in 10 minutes. You can turn off your camera. I will turn off mine. I will turn off my my microphone. And then right now is 2:47. So how about, let's say we're back at 3 o'clock. And Paul will begin the next section. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, it looks like it's just about time. So we'll get started back. I want to first thank Edna for her presentation, and as always, she does a really lovely job with that. And of course, you can send any questions that you have to the chat. Edna mentioned at the beginning of the session that I would monitor chat for her, and she's going to do likewise for me. So she's going to keep an eye on that. But I want to thank Edna. I also want to thank our interpreters, Sarah and Sarah, for such a phenomenal job. But let's move into the next section where we're going to just talk about planning just a little bit. So Edna did a really nice job showing us where there is intersection between the standards and the requirements of affiliation. And so in particular, Standard 5 and Standard 6 tend to join together very, very well, and they overlap with the requirement of affiliation 10. So, so 10 tells us that we must have academic assessment, that we've got to have institutional planning that integrates goals for institutional effectiveness. Well, 5, the standard, and remember the requirements of affiliation are kind of the minimum level for membership in the commission. And then the standards take you deeper. You know, Edna had mentioned that sometimes the requirements are yes, no. You know, do you have a planning system? Yes. Well, how good is it? And that's where you get into the standards. And so 5 focuses on learning and achievement, and 6 focuses on your overall planning and how do you allocate resources. And so that's where we're going to talk about just a little bit. And I'm hoping that I can integrate some of the things that Edna was talking about and translate them into 6, because recall at the beginning of the presentation, Edna showed you that we have some phenomenal institutions, but if anything tends to trip our institutions up during the evaluation process is standards 5 and 6. So let's take a little closer look. So these are the requirements of affiliation. And I mentioned that 10 is particularly important to planning, but also 11, that you have resources adequate to support the educational purposes, programs, and to ensure the financial stability of your institution. That is really, really important. So we've got to have not only planning in place, but we've got to tie it to what we're doing. And then we have to have enough resources to back it up. So let's get into 6 just a little bit. So we are going to cover most of the criteria in 6. And here are the first 4. The 3 of them start talking about planning. And then the 4th one, number 9, talks about assessment. So all of you are familiar with the standards, you know, and many of you were familiar with our previous set of standards where we have 14 of them. One of the things I really love about this is we've streamlined the standards in the last 6 years, and we have integrated assessment in every one of the standards. So it's not enough to say that we do strategic planning, it's tied to budget. It asks you, do you evaluate that? Right? So criteria 1. Reflects on the conclusions drawn from assessment results. So your objectives, the things that you're saying that are important to your organization, are drawn from the assessment results. Criterion 2, it incorporates the use of assessment results so that you have plans and you have processes for anticipating what folks need. Criterion 3, financial planning, that's aligned with the mission's goals, or the institution's mission and goals. Evidence-based. Well, where do we get evidence? We get evidence from assessment. So I would like for you to think about this as a machine, and all of this is driven. So those gears drive each other. So what we do in assessment drives planning, and they're interconnected parts. If any of those gears breaks, then we're in trouble. Remember that all the standards have that final criterion of assessment, and overall assessment, planning, and resource allocation at the institutional level is where we are kind of drawing that thread through everything that we do. So we're finding that many of our institutions are using self-study as the basis for planning. As a matter of fact, I've visited with several schools this fall, and they have made self-study the beginning of their strategic planning process. So they're connecting the strategic plan to the self-study, and they're doing that through the middle states standards and requirements of affiliation. Think about it. You go through those 7 standards, you go through those 15 requirements for affiliation, and then you look at the federal requirements, compliance with federal law. You are covering top to bottom, side to side, every element of your institution. So it is a really good spot to start. So the second approach is to use what we're seeing some of our institutions is identifying those institutional priorities. And some of you who are in the self-study process have been doing this. You're saying, these are the things that are most important to us. So it's almost like you're saying, here's our strategic goals. What do we need to do to align the 7 standards to those goals? Right? So either a standards approach or a priorities approach, both are perfectly acceptable. But what you have to do is integrate your assessment into the planning. Integrate the assessment. It's got to be data-driven. So one of the beauties of middle state standards is that it is mission-centric. I love that. So we have tiny little seminaries, and we have huge research institutions that use the exact same standards in reaffirming their accreditation. How do they do that? Well, they look at those 7 standards and they say, if I am Bucks County Community College, this is what's important to us, and this is how we live these 7 standards because this is our mission. So it's important for the mission to drive your first assessment. What's important to us, because that's what you're going to measure. Remember, if you don't measure it, you don't do it. So
start with that initial determination of who your mission is. What is it you're going to live? So some folks ask, well, we don't really do assessment to do our planning. But I would ask, do you do SWOT analysis? So Vicki, if you don't mind, let's just take a little poll here. How many of your organizations do SWOT analysis, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats during strategic planning? Vicki, can you launch that one for me? And the votes are coming in hot and heavy. We'll take just a few more seconds. All right, Vicki, will you publish those for us? Yes, yes, 85% of you are using SWOT analysis. Well, think about it. What is SWOT analysis? It is assessment. Strengths and weaknesses, internal assessment, opportunities and threats are external assessments. So those are the things that you're doing to help base your planning. What I would argue is that you could do SWOT analysis in a more thorough manner by looking at each of those standards. You know, so what is the strengths and weaknesses of our mission and goals? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the way that we live with integrity and assure that we're ethical? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the educational enterprise? And you can go all through them, but you're already doing one form of assessment. So most folks, you don't have to tell them that they may balk at it and say, we don't do assessment, but they do. This is what you can tell folks all the way through the organization. So what's the difference between that assessment that Edna was talking about in Standard 5 and the assessment we're discussing here in Standard 6? Well, Standard 5 talked about assessing the educational enterprise, okay? And how do you assure that learning is occurring? Standard 6 talks about how do you assess the rest of the organization? And I tell you, it's amazing how nervous folks at institutions, at universities and college get when you ask them about assessment. On the academic side, they've become accustomed to it. On finance or facilities or IT, they say, what do you mean assessment? So let's get into it just a little bit. What we want is integrated planning that drives our assessment. Oh, I've lost my ability to move forward. There we go. So we want to integrate. Give me just a second. There we go. So what we're looking for is integrated institutional planning. Remember, this is one of those requirements of affiliation. That's ROA 10, integrated institutional planning. It's not enough to have scattershot planning. You should knit your planning together. And there's 3 key components. So what are the practices? So what do you do? What are the systems or structure in place? And then thirdly, what is the culture for planning? Let's talk a little bit about the practices. So all of our planning starts with mission. You know, it has to. If not, we are just weaving down the road out of control. So it has to start with mission. And the key is making sure that the units across the institution are linked. And so mission can drive that. You know, does academic affairs connect with human resources? And does that connect with your enrollment management? And does that connect with our budgeting and our bursar's office? So what are our practices? What are the things that we are doing to knit these different elements together? Right? So the next element of integrated institutional planning is the structure. So what are the things that you do to assure, you know, not just your actions, but what mechanisms are there? This could be policies and procedures, but they should be designed to systematically weave those plans together. And the last is culture. Culture. So does the institution value assessment and collaboration? Now we talk about that, in colleges. I mean, that's kind of the root of the term college. It's collegial, which should mean that we are open to different ideas and we cooperate and we act as a community. But do we really? Do we really? Or do we get stuck in our silo and we focus on the things that are most important to us, and we don't think about how that may have a systemic effect everywhere else? So do we have a means of assuring that on a day-to-day basis, we will work together? And then are we flexible? When you throw a wrench into the system, do we have a means of adapting? So another little quiz. At your institution, where does planning take place? Where does planning take place? Is it at the cabinet level, your chancellor or president and her or his senior leaders? Is it at the individual departments, but in isolation? Is it across the institution and using the previous plan as a starting point? Or is it across the institution using assessment data as a starting point? So Vicki, launch that one for us and see where we are. Oh, this one's interesting. The results are coming in all over the place. All right, take just a few more seconds. I know this one made you think just a little bit more. You had to kind of ponder and say, well, how do we do that? And let's publish those, Vicki. All right. So for the most part, you're doing it kind of across the institution, but you're using history to drive the future. So the next most popular at 25% was using assessment data and integrating it across the institution. But 16% said top down. We're given what we, the plan, we're given our marching orders. And so, but it's encouraging to see that, when you combine those last two, 46 and 25%, you've got better than 70% of you, way over 2/3, that it is an integrated process. But is it history-based or is it assessment-based? So let's talk a little bit more how we can make it assessment-based. The biggest thing is starting with documentation. So you start with documents and you say, where are we going to draw data upon which we can assure that we have practices, structure, and culture that supports integrated planning. So if you have a planning committee, certainly the minutes and the resulting plan is documentation. Sometimes we do use historical documents to help drive this. Looking at the budgetary committee, looking at division and department goals. But is there a use of assessment in budget and planning? So that's kind of a key thing. Have we kind of determined if the way we've allocated resources in the past has been effective? Program reviews. Now, Eden mentioned program reviews, and we see this very commonly in academic programs. But have your organization started doing non-academic program reviews? Periodic assessment of operational areas at the college for those to judge whether the program is, or whether that operational area is effective, and to make some plans using that information to drive improvement. And then, of course, we've got other things. We always use student surveys, campus climate surveys. We evaluate our employees. We may get input from employers. We may get input from our alumni. all of those can give you insights into your planning. So one of the things that you want to do, use common language. Use common language. Use existing data. Don't go survey everybody under the sun trying to say, well, are we doing a good job? You have some of that data. I bet you anything, many of you already have messy data on the shelf. Bring it out and use it. Don't survey your students again. Survey fatigue is a real thing. So what assessments already exist? Where is it located? Who has it? And how can we use it? So sometimes what we already have, this documentation for our planning, may not be exactly what we need, but it may be a whole lot better than starting from scratch and reinventing the wheel. So Edna used a term a little while ago as she opened up, saying, sometimes don't let the pursuit of perfection get in the way of what's okay. Remember that, so it's not always going to be perfect. So we've got our mission. We've used assessment to help in our planning. So let's complete the cycle and talk about resource allocation. So mission should drive assessment. What you measure is what matters. The results of the assessments make the planning function work better because you've got useful data, you've got things that are useful to you. And if it's existing data, it's probably already put in the context of who your institution is. Now let's put the rubber to the road. Where do we put our resources? Do we have a standing budget that just kind of incrementally changes, or do we alter that budget based on the strategic priorities of the institution? Do we think of resources only as monetary resources? Or do we remember that there are at least 4 types of resources? Remember, certainly fiscal resources, those are the ones that come to mind first. But we also have our physical resources. Our buildings and our grounds. How do we use them? How do we allocate space to achieve particular purposes? Human resources. What people could we provide some release time to achieve a particular project? And then lastly, informational and technological resources. Now, those are at least 4 different types of resources that I would argue we should weave into our planning. What's our mission? How well do we achieve it? From that, what directions do we want to go? And then how are we going to put resources into place so that we are going to be able to achieve that? So that's what we need to talk about now. And this will be pretty quick here. I just want to, these are some of the other parts, some of the other criteria from Standard 6, 4, 5, 8, and again, number 9. All right. So the criteria say that you should have physical and human resources, as well as a physical and technological infrastructure. Those are the 4 things we were just talking about. That we've got 5 tells us that we've got a well-defined decision-making process, that it's clear that it's part of that, not only a practice, which may be a one-off, but we have the structure. We have the strategies to look at how well we're utilizing resources. It means that we're setting ourselves up for number 9, assessment. Periodic assessment of our planning process, periodic assessment of how well we're using all 4 types of resources, periodic assessment of the budgeting process, periodic assessment of how we are holding our organization and organization members accountable. Okay. So, question for you. Do your budget folks have, are they separate? So across your organization, we have especially in our larger institutions, we'll have budget managers, kind of scattered across the institution. Our smaller institutions may be centralized in the financial operations. But I want to ask, are those budget folks involved in planning? So I got 2 different polls here. So let's start with the first one. Are your budget officers really integrated into the planning at every level of your organization? Vicki, will you launch that one for me?
They're actually both listed up there, Paul.
They're both up? Okay, I can't see them. Ah, now I can, thank you. And they're open. So the second one is, does your budget begin with a base, or is it tied to initiatives? So those priorities, what's important to your organization? So we've got about a little over half of you have answered here. Give you a little more time. All right, looks like most everyone has voted. So can you end that for me, Vicki, and post the results? So are your budget officers involved in planning? And overwhelmingly, yes. And that's good because that can help understand where we need to allocate these resources. Remember, all 4 types of resources. Do your budgets begin with base or initiatives? Here, it's a majority is base. Now, I wish I could put a follow-up poll in there. Is it 60% base and then you have 40% of your budget available for initiatives? That's the question I wish I had thought about. Right. So here we go. Let's see if I can move. So what we want is a systematic resource allocation process. We want to have practices and structures that are designed to achieve something. Okay? Again, remember, we're looking for integrated institutional planning. And planning starts with mission. It then goes to assessment. Then we actually develop our plan and we allocate the resources. So it's integrated across. And again, all 4 types of our resources. And it's important that your planning timelines are fed by assessment results. Your planning timeline should be fed by assessment results. So if you're getting assessment at the end of an academic year, but your plan starts at the beginning of a calendar year, you've got an 8 or 9 month lag there. So think about how your institution can tie those things together better. You may need that lag. It may take a while to truly analyze the results at the end of an academic year, have an audit done, whatever it may be, and then think, okay, we're going to start again and launch the next plan in January. But it should be purposeful. And your planning should use gap analysis. Look at where you are, where you need to go, and what it's going to take to close that gap. Right? That gap could be gaps in your resources, but you should regularly assess and say, where are resources used effectively? Remember that criterion 9 it asks you, do you periodically assess how well you're doing? So one of the things that have changed in the standards, we used to ask institutions to look at themselves and make recommendations. Well, we changed that a little bit. We now ask our institutions to look for opportunities for continuous improvement and innovation. So what we're looking for is using assessment to identify areas where we can improve, or to identify those areas where we would like to capitalize on those positive results and allocate resources to these 2 gaps. Right? Again, it goes back to SWOT analysis. Almost all of you said that your organizations do SWOT analysis, but do they do it top to bottom and side to side? So we're accustomed to doing that. What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Here is opportunities for innovation. That's our strengths. Our opportunities for improvement. Those are would be weaknesses, or it may be external that we're identifying those gaps. But put this in terms, when you take it back to your campus, in terms that your colleagues across the campus are going to understand. Practically everybody will understand SWOT analysis. If you say we're going to do non-academic unit program review and assessment, they may get a little uncomfortable. So, and then you build the structures in that are going to support these processes. Okay? So that kind of wraps up just the straightforward approach to addressing standard 6. You know, you start with mission. From your mission, identify, do your assessment. That should drive planning, and then that should drive your resource allocation. And then we start over with assessment. How well did it work? But that's our normal process. What happens? What happens when the unexpected happens? So I've been talking with some folks about, they're in the self-study process, and they said, how do we address the pandemic? And, you know, there's lots of ways that you can address this, but I want you to think about what happened last March. You know, I would venture a guess that not one of our 524 member institutions had a pandemic response plan sitting on the shelf, ready to roll out. We went into spring break, delayed spring break for another week, and then we came out with a whole different model for how we were going to address our core functions at our colleges. And it was amazing to see how institutions did that. It's important that you stick to who you are. Stick to who you are. Even when things feel like it's fallen apart, your core identity drives everything. That core identity is your mission. And recall, the commission standards are to be applied through the lens of your institution's mission. So I've had folks ask me, said, you know, what if the pandemic is really taking us off our, taking the air out of the tires? Is the commission going to consider that? And I say, well, yes and no. Everybody had to adapt to very unforeseen circumstances, but you still must live up to the standards. Okay? So how did you adapt? You should still use mission at the center of who you are and what you're making your decisions on. And it's equally important to do assessment. And you did this. What did all of us do last March? When we found out that we were going to shift, most of us, to a remote environment, we took stock of what kind of resources we had. Where do we need more resources? How are we going to allocate those resources? And how are we going to make our students successful? Working with a college in the city, in New York, and they gathered up all of the laptops at their college, and they doled them out to students so that the students would be able to work remotely. Those laptops were for the labs, and they were for faculty and staff originally, but they shifted, keeping in mind who their mission was. Their mission is student success, assessed what they had, altered their plan, and allocated resources. So keep mission in mind. And think about contingency and emergency planning. You know, again, build flexibility into the process. Build flexibility into the process. If in the beginning you can do what if analysis, that's going to make you more resilient. Right? Remember your core identity. How are we going to function? And we do emergency planning all the time. Yeah? But think about how we might, as faculty members, we don't always think about emergency planning and having to pivot a lab-based class to online. But if we did, we would be better prepared for that. My guess is when we can go back to face-to-face education, we're still going to have very strong presence of those technological resources that we found out didn't want to use, but we found out we could use them, and we could use them to good effect. So emergent issues still require assessment. You know, it helps to think about what might happen, but when it occurs, you must do assessment. What do we have? How do we use it? How do we best fulfill our mission? So build resilience in your system. I am amazed at the stories I'm told by our member institutions about the lifting heaven and earth last semester and this semester to assure that our students were going to be successful. And I'll give you one example. One of my colleagues at my former institution, and this is an applied technology institution, one of my colleagues taught construction technology. So think carpentry. They go remote. How do you teach young women and men carpentry without having hammers, saws, and other tools and materials to do that? I mean, it is almost wholly lab-based. This guy did Zoom lessons, showed his students how to do it, loaded up a truck, found out where his students live, drove across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, delivering lab materials to the students so that they can complete their capstone. That's a unique response. And it worked. It was a heavy lift, but it worked. And he allocated, and his department head and his dean and his provost allocated the resources needed so that he could use that innovative approach to having his students complete their course. Again, go back to what Edna was saying. Don't let the pursuit of perfection get in the way of moving forward. Sometimes we have to look at it and say, let's go. This may not be our best, it may not be our most preferred, but we have to make sure that our students are successful. So what Edna and I hope to do today is to identify some of the expectations in Standard 5 and 6 and give you some tools to use for assessment and understanding the role of assessment and planning, and particularly assessment and resource allocation. You know, instead of those base budgets, how do we raise those initiatives to the level that that's where we're going to look at resources? I'd also like for you to remember that there's more than one type of resource. Many times we focus just on money when there are many others. And then talk about whether assessment or providing meaningful data. So I hope that we've achieved that. I know I rushed through just a bit, but we're going to do question and answer again. I'll remind you that use the chat function. Edna, well, I'm going to run through these next couple of slides just to get out where I can see the chat as well. But we'll have some questions, but there are resources available to you. Edna and I are available. The commission website is available. We have different, unfortunately, we don't have our annual conference this year, but we do have town halls, which have been amazingly attended. Instead of a couple hundred people, we had 1,200 people at our last one, remote. But you can always go to your liaison vice president. You know, Edna, I, Bob Bonfilio, Sean, Ellie, Kush, we are happy to answer any questions that you might have. And Edna and I thank you for being here with us today. So I'm going to clear my screen so that we can see the chat.
there are a few comments here that I'm interested in, and I'm sorry they were not made public, but I do agree with Shanti. Training, and combined with food. If you feed them, they will
With food, yeah.
Yes.
You know, I was talking about building some resilience into your organization. You know, and training is one of the best ways to do that. If people are cross-trained, if folks understand each other's roles and positions. Had a colleague at in my last role, who was immune compromised, you know, and so she absolutely could not do face-to-face. And so we did a bunch of swapping out on some of our what we were teaching, so that she didn't have to do face-to-face. So.
Mhm. The other one is when you were talking about what are you using as the basis for your planning and budgeting, and the comment is a history and assessment. We cannot use either as a basis in isolation, and I could not agree more.
Yeah.
And it brings back something that I should have said in terms of assessment is you don't assess everything every year. It is not possible. It is overly onerous. You can't do that.
Right.
Plus,
one of the
you
things
cannot be always in constant state of flux, changing everything.
Right.
So when you develop your assessment plan, you're strategic in your planning. These things we're going to assess this year. Next year, we're going to assess. And so just like you have a cycle for program review, you should have a cycle for assessment. And so, yes, if you are using assessment for resource allocation, yes, assessment should be used, but what you're assessing that year, for that year, or what you assessed last year. But you have to use history as well, because as I said, you will not have assessment results of everything every year.
Right. And if you try, you're chasing your tail, you know? So one of the things we ask you to do with assessment is to use that assessment to affect change. Well, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to think about what that change should be. How do we put it into place? And then check it again to say, did it work? Did it work as we had wished? We do that in academics, you know? We wait and we let a couple of cycles of students go through the new course design or whatever it may be, so that we can gather enough meaningful data to evaluate it. So let's do that in our other processes as well. Some we may be asked to respond to more quickly. You know, in these days of enrollment issues, those may be assessed on a little more rapid cycle, but not everything every year. It's so true.
Right. So the other comment is about, yes, you did not have a pandemic plan, but most of you had a disaster plan. I think the major difference here is that because I was part of my institution, I was the lead for the academic piece for the disaster plan. But we were planning for a hurricane. We were planning for a major fire. And so most of us, I think, were planning for short-term disasters.
Yeah.
And most of us were planning for physical disasters. And the major difference here is that where we were most affected in this one was in the academics. Something that even when in my former institution, I was planning to, what are we going to do if we don't have access to labs? What are we going to do if we don't have access? So we actually were looking for, do we have the capacity to conduct instruction online? To what extent do we have the capacity? And part of what we did with that disaster planning is, what training do we need to do now in the event that there was, we had this huge building for biology and chemistry. What if that's not available? What if there's a huge fire there? So that's the only thing that I can think of that might be even remotely similar to what is happening right now, that all of a sudden you have to conduct instruction in a different way. So there are lots of lessons learned for us here. And one of the major lessons learned is that those disaster plans that probably helped you get started and get going. Assessment, how did those work? What do you need to do now to improve those plans? Because even if we no longer have pandemic, whenever that is, you still need to consider disaster planning. Just you are now expanding disaster planning to a different level because of the lessons learned. And I hate to say this, but at least Dr. Fauci and people are saying this is not the only one that we're going to be dealing with in this century. And so this is, if I were you, I would use that also as an example of user assessment results for planning. Paul?
The, you know, it's interesting that folks talk about when things go back to normal, you know, they're not going back to normal because we have learned lessons in our, how we pivoted, and we've learned that we have some amazing abilities that we never thought we did. And so it may be very different. You know, we may have very different looking institutions when all of this is resolved. We've had a question about giving some examples of evidence of use of assessment results in planning and resource allocation. Yeah, and we've seen this even from what Eden was just talking about. In the response to the pandemic, most of our schools spent some time this summer evaluating that very short-term emergent response, you know, from March to May. And then they said, okay, how do we learn from that? And what do we do? And what does that mean in terms of our, so I've seen institutions that looked at the evaluation of their use of facilities and energy management and said, you know, if I've got this big classroom building, but all of those classes are going to be online, can I take this building offline and allocate those energy resources elsewhere? Okay. I saw again a facilities and equipment technology issue. All of these labs, computer labs. You know, how can we best repurpose this? You know, do we refresh this lab with desktop machines, or do we turn that into laptop machines that are portable? So just a couple of examples of not necessarily the academic enterprise. It impacted the academic enterprise, but it was really about technology resources and facility resources, and said, do we really need this? If not, how can I reallocate that resource? So I saw an institution that because of the lack of people on campus, they used the end of the spring into the summer as a means of redoing all of their parking lots. Because they know that folks are going to come back. Some of the parking lots were in pretty tough shape, yeah, some potholes and some unsafe type of cracks and that type of thing. And since nobody was there, they said, let's get ready for when they do come back. Okay. Otherwise, you know, typically they never would have had the capacity to close down lots and do that type of refresh. All right, I see
Linda.
a hand up, Linda.
Can you speak to the impact though of like not getting housing or other meals and other income, especially when you still have to pay for the housing? I mean, that's really a big issue for a lot of places, is that students aren't living on campus and you still have to pay for the cost of the dorms.
Yeah, you do. And what a lot of our institutions have done is looked at minimizing that impact in terms of downsizing, at least temporarily, staff and dining services. And in the housing area, I've seen them, like I mentioned, taking buildings offline, you know, but it's you still have the debt costs that goes with that. And that's where our institutions have struggled and will continue to struggle. So it may be that some of them may be looking at that reallocation instead of where I would have spent on expendables. I'm going to put that to debt service. Will it cover it? I don't know.
But you should address it in your self-study and everything straight up.
Sure.
Absolutely. Okay.
One of the things we're asking our institutions to do is talk about your response to the pandemic, but also talk about how you have remained central to your mission and you have remained focused on fulfilling the standards and the requirements of affiliation.
Okay. Thank you.
Certainly.
An example that not many people would like to hear about is when you make decisions about cutting programs. And so there are many different reasons and many different ways that institutions do program prioritization, but an important piece should be assessment results. And so one example that I have seen recently is when an institution just was not meeting the licensure exam results were not providing, and as much as they tried to do so, there was really no way that they could really revise the whole thing in order to meet those licensure requirements. So sometimes you have to make hard decisions like that. And I would say that a lot of times also, as you're making those decisions, assessment itself can actually provide very good information at how you can modify or enhance in order to preserve, not only in order to cut.
Other questions or comments? Well, I'm the new guy at the commission. I just joined the commission in August. And so this is my first opportunity to do one of these. And so, of course, they paired me with the senior teacher here, the outstanding teacher of the decade, I guess to make me look bad, but also to hopefully keep me on track. But I want to thank you for your time this afternoon. I want to thank Sarah for helping us in terms of interpretation. And of course, Vicki and KJ for keeping us moving along there. Edna, any last words?
I just want to, again, reiterate, thank you. Thank you for spending the time with us. We apologize for the mishaps. I think we're all familiar with having mishaps in this era. But I want to say again, our VP liaisons are here for you to provide assistance. I cannot say that we are experts on everything, but one thing that we can do is that when you ask us a question, we're going to go and research and find and provide some suggestions for you, or even better, connect you with somebody else who's doing a really good job with that. So I think that's one thing that in Middle States we're really good at. And so we welcome your information about wonderful examples of what you're doing. And please know that as you write your self-study reports and your follow-up reports, we look at them closely and we are always cognizant of what are the evaluators looking for. But at the same time, we know that evaluators differ from team to team. And I want to emphasize, particularly those of you who are currently undergoing self-study, that what the commission is looking for is equity, consistency, and fairness throughout the evaluation. So while some evaluators may be really hard and some not so much, the idea for that second level of review that we have is to bring that fairness and consistency throughout. So we are consistent in how we are expecting the standards and the requirements of affiliation to be applied and complied with. So we're here for you. Contact us. You have our emails, and even as we're working from home, we are constantly in touch with our institutions. So thank you for being part of this conversation, and I wish you the best and good health.
So
Thank you.
bye, y'all. Take